We just had Senator Gillibrand, so it's lots of good energy in this room. And we're excited to continue the conversation. My name is David Gellis. I'm a climate reporter at the New York Times, but I wear a couple of different hats, and I also think a lot about workers' rights and what it takes to create an equitable economy where the men and women actually on the front lines doing the work get the care, the treatment, the benefits, the pay they deserve. And so we're delighted to have with us two of the country's foremost advocates for workers' rights with us today. Rebecca Dixon, at my left, head of the National Employment Law Project. And Ai-jen, where are you calling in from? I'm going to roast you here.
I'm calling in from Italy, where I am currently a Rockefeller Foundation, a resident at the Bellagio Center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ai-jen Poo, of course, is the head of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I really want to try to ground this conversation in lived experiences. And Rebecca, if I may, let's begin with you and not only the experiences of the men and women who you work with and try to improve their lives for, but your own family, your own lived experience as a child growing up in Mississippi, the daughter of men and women who worked really, serious jobs on the front lines of this economy. How did that experience, you seeing what your family lived through, lived with, inform the work you're doing today?
Sure. So I'm from a small town in rural southwest Mississippi. It's called Brookhaven. And it's the kind of town where the major industries are lumber and like grocery warehousing, Walmart distribution center, that kind of thing. And it has a storied history in civil rights. And one important fact is it didn't desegregate schools till 1969. So that was way past Brown v. Board of Education. So if you understand sort of the kind of environment it was. And so my father would be 85 years old this summer. And that's the kind of environment he grew up in was worse than the kind of environment that I grew up in. And he worked really hard. He worked all the time around the clock, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, odd jobs on the weekends. And I remember him coming home exhausted, but also angry. And I remember vividly this vein dancing on the side of his head while he was yelling. And it was because he could never get ahead no matter what he did. Part of the reason that is some of the work that we do here at NELP. So the Fair Labor Standards Act is part of the New Deal suite of programs, and that policy will be 85 next month. And so the things that we put into place in that policy, where we excluded folks who worked in agriculture, so a chunk of my dad's life he worked on a dairy farm, that work didn't count for Social Security. It didn't count for unemployment if he had lost his job. And so we excluded Black workers, we excluded women, we excluded immigrant workers from these foundational rights, benefits, and protections. And they're still excluded in a lot of ways. And so the work I do is how do we fix that? And how do we shift the economic paradigm for working people so that folks like my dad, that their work actually means the same as the rest of our work?
Thank you. Ai-jen, I can't see you anymore. Are you still with us?
I am. I'm
Okay,
here.
I'm just not looking at you at that screen. I don't know if there's a way to. But without looking at you, without twisting my neck, I'm just going to have, there you are. All right, that's awesome. Much better. I wonder, this notion of sort of workers who fall through the cracks. It was powerful to hear Rebecca's own experience with that. And the work you do with domestic workers, I have to believe, is very much a part of this same conversation. Can you talk about this class of domestic workers who, as a business reporter, someone who's thought a lot about these relationships between major employers and their workers, that's sort of a relationship many of us sort of intuitively understand. But the domestic worker, I think, is sort of a category that often, I gotta believe, falls through the cracks. Who are the men and women you're trying to represent, and what are some of the challenges they're facing?
Right. Well, so domestic workers are all the workers who work inside of our homes. Essential, we call it the work that makes all other work possible, because it is the childcare that makes it possible for working aging and disability care that supports the dignity of people with disabilities and older loved ones so that they can actually stay at home and age in place. And it's the cleaners who maintain sanity inside of our homes. And it's a workforce that's overwhelmingly women, more than 90%, and majority women of color, and has always been a profession that's been associated with women of color, immigrant women, Black women. In fact, some of the first domestic workers in the US were Black women. And there is a long pattern and history of exclusion from labor rights, like Rebecca talked about. And that exclusion has kind of repeated itself over and over again in a way that's kind of embedded in our culture, so much so that we often refer to the work as help as opposed to the profession it is for millions of people. And so despite the fact that it's among the most essential fundamental work in our economy today, it's also some of the most insecure and undervalued work. 82% of domestic workers came into the pandemic without a single paid sick day. And that is still the case.
Rebecca, can you give us a bit of a status report from the front lines? When you're in dialogue with workers out there, what are some of the challenges they're facing? We heard about some of the ones for domestic workers in particular. Can you paint a slightly broader picture? Again, from where I sit on the business desk, we sometimes found ourselves writing stories about how corporations were actually taking better care of their workers during the pandemic or trying to step up and give bonuses. I have to believe that wasn't the case for all workers across the country.
Right. So we remember workers being called essential workers, and then that kind of fizzled out, right? But we know historically that Black and brown workers have always worked the most dirty jobs, the most dangerous jobs. And so much so that they used to call those jobs Negro work back in the day. And so it's not new that folks are working without protection and with poor health and safety protections. And we saw that during the pandemic where those workers didn't have rights to PPE. They didn't have rights to distancing. They had to go into meat packing processing plants and work side by side in those dire conditions. So some of the other kinds of things folks are seeing is wage theft. So you are assigned a certain wage, but you're not paid that wage. So employers actually steal billions of dollars from workers every year. And if you look at minimum wage violations alone, it's $15 billion a year. That's not going into workers' pockets and not going into the community where those workers are. The other kinds of things folks are dealing with is harassment on the job, retaliation for speaking up for their rights. They are often worried about losing their job, and they often don't qualify for unemployment insurance if they are laid off from their job. So we often think of like separate people, but what's interesting is the intersectional nature of this, where it could be the same worker, so the same Black woman, where all of these things are falling on her. And so that's like one of the critical things to think about in this work is that it's multifaceted. We can't just fix one piece, we have to fix the whole.
This is a dire picture, and yet looking at both of you, I know neither of you are defeatist. You're both out there trying to do the work. Ai-jen, I want to start with you. Talk about some of the substantive changes that actually have the potential to bend the curve on some of these issues that can seem so intractable.
Well, so we have an epidemic of low-wage work in America, and I think raising wages is the first step to addressing it. And so raising the minimum wage would be hugely transformative. And that's something that Rebecca and her team have been leading on for a long time, along with many unions, SEIU, and others. I mean, this is a surefire way to address the quality of work in this country. One of the issues I work a lot on is the care economy, actually improving the quality of care jobs, which are jobs that can't be outsourced, they won't be automated, and they're jobs that are in huge and growing demand because we have a growing aging population in need of care, and millennials are having babies at a rate of 4 million babies born per year. We know these jobs are needed and are here to stay, and we could make them great jobs. Just like we turned manufacturing jobs from dangerous sweatshop jobs that lots of immigrants did and poverty wage jobs, we turned them into a pathway to the middle class and created the largest middle class in the history of the world. If we invest in low-wage service jobs like care jobs, we could do the same for this era. And I find that so hopeful. There are things that we know how to do, that we know can be make a transformational difference in this moment that we're in on low-wage work in America.
And I'll just note that it seems like the opportunity there is only going to get larger as more and more of the economy shifts to service roles, particularly on the domestic workers front. Rebecca, on the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. In reporting a book recently, I came across a statistic that made clear that if the federal minimum wage had simply kept pace with inflation over the last 30 plus years, it would be closer to $25 to $30 an hour. And so that gives you a sense of just how much everyday workers in this country have fallen behind over the past couple generations. Just to put it plainly, how is it that the federal minimum wage is still at this astonishingly low rate and has not even come close to keeping up with inflation? What's going on in Washington, where you live and work?
I think that there's, and I think folks would agree, there's a disconnect with what the public wants and what is happening in Congress. And where we have seen movement has been in states and localities. And so lots of states have raised their wage. Mm-hmm. And women, fast food workers, launched the Fight for 15 in 2012. And that movement has put billions of dollars into the pockets of workers and worked to close the racial wealth gap. And that's huge. And so to get the federal minimum wage raised, we would help a lot more Black workers who are actually, the majority of them live in the southern states, and lots of the southern states pay $7.25 because they don't have a minimum wage. So they just track the federal minimum wage. And, beyond the $7.25, we have our tipped workers who are restaurant workers and other workers who work for tips, and their wage is $2.13 an hour, and it's been stuck there for 30 years.
Again, I keep coming back to sort of my grounding as a business reporter, and there's a narrative out there that some benevolent corporations and CEOs are sort of on the front foot and have recognized that this is a systemic issue and are trying to really take proactive steps to make it right. And to be sure, there are a couple examples you can point to of CEOs and corporations that are maybe taking those tentative steps. But I want to put the question to you, Ai-jen and Rebecca, is that enough? I mean, can we count on our corporate leaders, if our political leaders are not up to the task, to actually make the progress we need to deliver the benefits that the workers you care so much about actually need?
We absolutely need our corporate leaders to step up, and we need them to put their government relations dollars behind advocacy on behalf of improving the quality of work and wages for workers. And I think it's good for business, and it's bad for the country to have an economy where literally millions and millions of people are working incredibly hard, doing everything right, and still can't make ends meet, still can't take care of their families. And I think, it's bad. It's a bad look for the country. And we need our corporate leaders to step up and address it, both in their own internal policies, but also in advocacy for change.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, I would love your perspective on this. I would love to believe that the government relations dollars of multinational corporations were being directed at efforts to raise the federal minimum wage. Something tells me that's not what's happening. What are you seeing, actually, when it comes to the way big business is trying to influence federal policy on these critical issues you care so much about?
Well, they definitely are wanting to capture all of the power. And by that I mean, when the Fair Labor Standards Act and those other laws were passed, there was strong law about being able to organize. And over time, we've seen that erode. And so workers can't easily join together to form a union and be able to bargain with their employers over wages and working conditions. And employers are standing in the way of the PRO Act, which is legislation that would actually make it easier for workers to join together collectively and press for their rights. So what I'm seeing is employers actually sort of building in their business model exploitation of workers, particularly our underpaid workers of color.
Ai-jen, you mentioned the minimum wage as one tool that could broadly improve conditions and lives of some of the workers we're talking about today. What are some others? We just heard about unionizing. Is that even, is organizing something that works for a workforce as disparate as domestic workers?
Absolutely. I mean, well, domestic workers actually are legally not included in the right to collectively bargain and organize under the National Labor Relations Act, but that has not stopped domestic workers from organizing. We have a community at the National Domestic Workers Alliance of almost 400,000 domestic workers around the country, 69 local affiliate organizations who are organizing day in and day out, advocating for better working conditions and for dignity for this workforce. And Black women from the South who migrated to the Midwest to cities like Chicago about 45 years ago were among the first to start the first home care unions in the country. And now there are over 1 million workers who are unionized as home care workers. And it really is the only pathway that has been proven to create good jobs for workers like home care workers and other care workers who work in sectors where the wages are chronically and shockingly low. And so, for example, SEIU Local 775 in Washington State, the starting wages are $17 an hour, entry level for a home care worker, because the union has fought and fought and fought to raise those wages. Those workers also have health care. They also have retirement benefits. Now you're starting to see a pathway to a job where workers can really sustain, as opposed to the dominant model in home care right now, where you have annually a 50% turnover of the workforce because people simply can't survive doing this work.
Well, those are important glimmers of hope. I want to hear a few more in just one sec, but first I'm going to plug the Q&A session. In just a couple minutes, I'm going to be turning to you, so think of some questions you have for both of our panelists. We'll get to those in a few minutes. Rebecca, some other glimmers of hope. We know how dire the challenges are, but we also, as I said, you guys are not defeatists. You're out there doing the work. Mm-hmm. Point us to some victories in the last couple years. What is giving you hope? What gets you up every morning when you say, that worked, the next thing can too?
So one of the things that is giving me the most hope, and building on what Ai-jen said, is policy plus power. So when I started in this work, there was not very much like making sure that you were talking to directly impacted folks about what they need, about what their challenges are. And so policy would get created and it wouldn't help them because we weren't centering them in designing it. Well, what I've seen now is workers at the forefront of designing the policies and the work, and like a recognition that their agency and their organizing is needed in order for us to win these policy battles, to make sure that the policy gets enforced, to make sure it doesn't get reversed as soon as there's another legislative session. So really am hopeful about policy plus power, and it is like connecting with the upswing we're seeing in worker organizing. Now, from a practical standpoint, we did see during the pandemic that the federal government invested substantially in unemployment insurance and expanded it. $700 billion went into the pockets of families. That's a huge victory, and we are trying to build on those expansions and use the evidence of how that reached more workers to create permanent reforms in that program. And I would say the other things that are happening is there's a lot of activity around gig work and platform-based work, and those workers organizing for health and safety and wages and a whole suite of benefits and protections.
Thank you. We'll go to Q&A in just a minute. Ai-jen, I'm not looking at you anymore, but I think you're still there. I can see you over
I am.
my shoulder. I'm going to pretend you're there. I'm going to radically oversimplify here, but it does seem to me that our nation has sort of been on a multi-generational journey, and that, just to be reductivist about it, things have gotten worse for workers over the last many decades. Do you feel like we're still continuing on that terrible trend line, or are we at a moment where maybe this pendulum that has swung so far in the favor of corporations and business interests and so far away from the interests of workers is potentially at that moment where it sort of pauses and maybe starts to swing back in the favor of the men and women actually doing the work on the front lines?
Well, I don't know if we're quite at a pendulum swing moment yet, but I do know that there is a rising movement of low-wage workers that is demanding change and is not accepting poverty wage work any longer and the insecurity of work in America. It's a movement that is incredibly inspiring. It's multiracial, multi-generational, lots of young workers getting involved, and you're seeing it in the care workers movement. We were just part of the first ever Care Workers Summit in Washington in April, where we had workers from across the care economy, from early childhood and childcare to direct care in nursing homes and the home and community setting, all union and non-union workers all speaking with one voice, demanding good jobs, dignified wages, benefits, real security, and the kind of energy and momentum and the stories about the organizing and the campaigning that they're doing. It really it's caught the attention of the White House. While we were there on April 18th, the president signed the most sweeping executive order in the history of the country to improve, directing federal agencies to do everything in their power to improve the quality of work for care workers and improve access to care for working families. And I think it's sectors like care where workers have been undervalued for a very long time, and you're starting to see real transformation, not just in the narrative, but on the part of elected officials and decision makers really acting, really signing up. Senator Gillibrand, as an example, somebody who has championed these policies like paid family and medical leave, childcare, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. These policies have moved from being seen as kind of a special interest women's agenda issue to the center of the economic agenda. And I think that is a sign of progress and is a huge source of hope for me.
I'm going to call that maybe the beginnings of the pendulum swing.
All right,
Let's get some questions from the audience. If you would please briefly introduce yourself and also ask a direct question of one of our panelists. Yeah, please, in the back.
Hi there. I'm Kathy Baughman-McLeod. I'm the director of the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. My question is, are you seeing climate justice and climate coming into the labor rights work that you're doing?
I absolutely am. So there's a lot of money that was pushed through Washington with the Inflation Reduction Act and the other legislation, and a lot of that is directed towards climate. And then there are certain industries where the impact is going to be felt. And so it is intricately connected with these workers who will be doing construction and all of these other pieces for climate. And so we are looking at that, and we're also looking at it from the standpoint of safety for workers. So with heat standards and the increase of the temperature and those kinds of things. And then I would say the other piece is looking at the unemployment insurance program for disasters as they are more and more frequent, and can that program grow to help support workers.
Great. Another question? Please, in the back.
Hi, Ai-jen and Rebecca. I'm Meg from the Rockefeller Foundation on the EO team. I think connected to this, we've seen kind of a renewed focus in the U.S. around industrial policy, or really using government to spurn sectors of the economy that are viewed strategically important. I'm just curious, how you think that impacts kind of workers more broadly that maybe aren't in those strategically important sectors, and in particular, domestic workers. Is industrial policy useful there, or workers being left out? How does that impact?
Ai-jen, do you have thoughts on this?
I think emphasizing the role of government in ensuring that corporate actors and that markets are actually working for people is really, really important. And I think we need to really expand and think critically about who we're including in our conversation about industrial policy. When I think about, a lot of people don't think about care as an industry, but when you do think about where there's going to be job growth, where there's going to be huge amounts of economic activity and need, care and care jobs are front and center. And in fact, when a government actually can pull levers like resourcing Medicaid and expanding funding for Medicaid that raises wages for home care workers, for example, in the home and community-based service program, that is industrial policy. And the proposed investments that were on the table last year that the Biden administration has championed in, for example, home and community-based services, represent some of the most significant, if not the most significant, proposed investment in the creation of good jobs that would directly benefit women and women of color in the history of the United States. So absolutely, I think industrial policy is central. It's a critical conversation. We need to think much more expansively, I think, than we currently are about what should be included.
Any other questions? I'll keep going if not. I want to build, oh yes, please.
Hi, Rachel Iskoff from the Rockefeller Foundation also. Rebecca, you were also a Bellagio Fellow last year, so just wanted to hear what your focus was on that time, and since it's been, I don't know, almost a year, if anything has come from that focus time that you had there.
Sure. So I'm working on a writing project called The Case for Ending Occupational Segregation. And when I say occupational segregation, like we tend to think of the US as equal opportunity, but it's actually not. 87% of occupations are actually racially segregated, and that's after you control for education. And what that means is that women, immigrants, people of color are trapped at the bottom of the labor market across time, even after they have, say, Black women have increased their college graduation rate, but the number one job in America for Black women is cashier at $9 an hour, versus the number one job for white women is registered nurse at $32 an hour. And so what we do know in terms of like how have we increased wages for Black women over time is by integrating them in the labor market into other kinds of occupations that pay better wages. And occupational integration is responsible for 65% of their wage growth from, say, 1940 to 2010. And so it's a complicated problem, and what I'm trying to do is put it on the map as something that we should pay attention to. It's not natural. It's actually something that we can pull policy levers and change. And then as far as like how far have I gotten, I'm starting to work with an editor to help round the piece out beyond just sort of the nerdy, wonky research, but to like include the people element. So really deeply grateful to the Rockefeller Foundation for that opportunity. I still keep saying, but I feel like it was life-changing. Like it allowed me to really step away from my really demanding job and think meta, high level about how the work I'm working on connects with what NELP is doing and how we really do work to shift this economic paradigm for working people.
That's amazing. And Ai-jen, maybe in our last minute or two, can you tell us what work you're doing at Bellagio right now?
I'm really glad that Rebecca used the words life-changing, because I really think that that's a perfect description. Having the space to step away and to be around other residents. There's an astrophysicist here. There is a food systems expert here. There are artists. There's a poet and a visual artist who are working on a project related to climate change. It's just an incredibly generative environment. And I'm working on a project that is about care. It is about how investing in the care economy not only is one of the most transformational investments we could make in American families, but it also could be a huge part of the solution to some of our more existential challenges like inequality and polarization and loneliness, social isolation. So that's what I'm working on here.
That's great. Thank you to both of you. We are at time, and I am going to bid adieu to all of you. Thank you very much, and especially thanks to our two panelists.